This man kept a literal scoreboard of his murders, and he may be one of the most prolific serial killers that you may have never even heard about. Okay, bud. Okay. Oh, Jesus. What a creep. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Scoreboard Killer. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, hello, my name is Mike. If you're new to the channel, I tell 3 true crime stories a week on YouTube every single week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. I post about 1 or 2 stories at least every single day over there. The link to that is in the description below in the link tree, or it also pops up here at some point in the beginning and at the end of the video, so plenty of places for you to follow over there if you want to. You don't gotta, but you can if you want. Also in the link tree below, you'll find my merch store. We sell like t-shirts and hoodies and stuff like that. We ship all over this entire planet. All of it. Every part of it. Even where you live, unfortunately. Yeah. I'm sorry, that was rude. Lastly, if there's a case you want me to cover, just email me. My email is listed below. Just email me the name of the case or the individual, where it happened, when it happened. I'll add it to my list. I do have over 5,600 names on that list right now, so it may be a very long time before I get to yours. I pick my cases at random, just to be fair, so I can't promise you when I'll actually cover that case, but it will happen eventually. At any rate, let's get into today's story of this total, complete wackadoo. Now, typically, when we talk about a serial killer, usually, almost without fail, their origins are a bit dark. Typically, they are people who have dealt with a lifetime or a youth lifetime of emotional, physical, and sometimes sexual abuse, likely from a family member. Their parent or parents are alcoholics. Sometimes the parents are never in the house. And most serial killers just grew up in a very unfortunate situation. But that is not the case for this guy. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19th, 1945. He was born in Long Beach, California. I have been to Long Beach a few times. That's where the Queen Mary is. And it is a beautiful ship, side note. And if you live in that area, you've never been to the Queen Mary, go to Long Beach and visit that thing, because it's stunning. So anyway, end of side note. Randy was one of 4 kids. He was the only son. He had 3 sisters. His parents were Opal and Herbert Kraft. Those are 2 of some of the oldest names I've ever heard. The Kraft family was never a rich, wealthy family. They were also never really a poor family. They lived a very modest life. Both parents held jobs, and they did whatever they could to support the family, support the kids. It was even said that, you know, Randy's mom and his older sisters, they all really kind of pampered Randy. They took really good care of him, actually. His dad wasn't abusive. His dad wasn't really an alcoholic, but his dad was pretty distant. And the reason why is because his dad was trying to work as many jobs as he could to support the family. And so he just wasn't really ever around, per se. But yeah, I mean, they lived a very modest life. Nothing special, nothing spectacular. They were just kind of your average, everyday American family. And Randy, as a kid growing up, was described as just this really quiet but good kid. He was well behaved. He never got into trouble. He was described by many people as being really sweet and kind and nice. He was also, like, intellectually ahead of his class. He was really, really intelligent. By his teenage years, Kraft had these thoughts or aspirations of becoming a U.S. senator. He really kind of fell into politics around his teenage years. By that time, he's living in the Huntington Beach area with his family, California. He was enrolled at Westminster High School. He graduated without any issues. He did great. By the time he graduated high school, Randy Kraft had began to realize or understand more about himself, that he was gay. But he was afraid to really tell anyone in his life because, again, this is the 60s, and if you think people had it bad in like the 80s and 90s for being gay, it was even worse then as well. And so like coming out was just not really an option. He would then enroll in Claremont Men's College in Claremont, California, and he was trying to get a bachelor's degree in economics. By 1964, while in college, he would end up getting a job as a bartender. He worked at a local place called the Garden Grove, and this was like a cocktail lounge that was meant for the gay citizens of the area. And also at that point, he's experimenting with casual sexual encounters with men. He would travel kind of in the area around. This is before Grindr and all that, of course, but I guess he would meet people in the old-fashioned way, and he would, have a porky time with them. That was a weird way to describe it. It's said that Randy Kraft had tried to low-key, plant the seed in his parents' and his sister's minds that he was gay by inviting over male friends of his, to their house for dinners and stuff, trying to coax them into it, but it didn't really work. In 1966, he had his first run-in with the law. He had tried to proposition for a sexual encounter an undercover officer. Now, at that point, Randy had no criminal history. He had never been arrested. He had always been this really good kid, behaved, nothing on his rap sheet. And so they basically just dismissed the charges and let him go. By his senior year in college, Randy's studies had begun to kind of plummet. He was not paying attention in school. He wasn't completing assignments. He was just sort of distancing himself from school, which was very unlike him because he was always very career-oriented, which meant he was very education-oriented to get to that career. And so this would actually lead to him failing to graduate. And so he was held back, and he had to wait almost a year in order to kind of make up for everything, and then he finally graduated. He then joined the Air Force after school, and he at one point was promoted to Airman First Class and a supervisor. And then by 1969, he had told his fellow Air Forcemen that he was gay. He revealed his homosexuality, and they gave him a general discharge immediately afterwards. His dismissal was based on medical issues, which wasn't true because he had no medical issues. He was discharged immediately after telling them he was gay. The Air Force always refused to ever change that status. This then caused him to kind of move back home with his parents. He got a job as a bartender, and that is what he was doing by 1970. At that point, he is about 25 years old, and he was in Huntington Beach, where he met a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Allen Fincher. The photo I'm showing is an older photo of him who would later, many years later, testify in court about this encounter. Joseph had recently run away from home, and so when he encountered Kraft, Kraft invited him to his apartment. And he promised the 13-year-old boy, there's a woman there that you can have sex with. But that was a lie. Almost immediately after Kraft got this 13-year-old kid into his apartment, he offered him substances that the young boy willingly took, and this caused him to basically fall unconscious, and Kraft then beat him and then sexually assaulted him. And that is when he went from a pretty decent, normal citizen to a human piece of shit. But this was only the beginning. Joseph managed to kind of come to where he escaped the apartment. He alerted authorities, or actually a bystander alerted authorities when they saw this young kid who appeared to be completely out of it. But the police would say to him, because you willingly took these drugs and willingly entered the apartment, there's nothing we can do. What? Okay, that's unusual. Fine. And so no charges were ever pressed against him. By 1971, Randy Kraft would enroll at Long Beach State University. At one point, he began to date a young man who was 21 or 22 years old at the time. And then the murders began. And when I say murders, this guy, he did a lot. He did a whole lot. Between 1971 and 1983, Randy Kraft is suspected to have murdered, I shit you not, 67 young men, all between the ages of 13 years old and 35 years old. Most of his victims were lured back to his home and with the promise of, drugs or alcohol or sex. Once he had them essentially unconscious because he also drugged them, typically in his car, he would torture them. He would sexually assault them, and then he would kill them. His most common method of murder, or the way he killed them typically, was either he strangled them with something or he manually strangled them. Sometimes he bludgeoned them. He would burn his victims' genitals with the car lighter thing. Some of these men were found with objects shoved into their rectums. Some of them had objects inserted into their, the other part. He would mutilate some of them. He would dismember some of them. On October 5th, 1971, a 30-year-old man named Wayne Joseph Duquette, his body was found. He was the first person found that would eventually be linked to this killer. Duquette had been a bartender at a local gay bar who had last been seen on September 20th, 1971. 15 months later, a 20-year-old Marine named Edward Daniel Moore was discovered murdered. He had last been seen at Camp Pendleton, leaving it on December 24th, 1972. His body was found 2 days later near Seal Beach, California. He had been tied up, and he had abrasions all over his body that indicated he had been shoved out of a moving vehicle. 6 weeks later, the body of an unidentified male between the ages of 17 and 25 was found. And this was along the Terminal Island Freeway in Wilmington. He had been killed by a ligature, and he had a sock shoved into his rectum. 2 months later, the body of a 17-year-old boy was found. His name was Kevin Clark Bailey. He was found along a freeway near Huntington Beach. They determined that he had been sexually assaulted, and he had things inserted inside his front part. Then a couple months later, another unidentified male's body was found, killed in a very similar fashion. And then a 20-year-old was found. His name was Ronald Weeb. He was found along the 405 freeway, and he had been strangled to death. It also appeared he had been at one point bound because he had marks in his wrists and his ankles. By November of 1974, 3 more bodies were found. 20-year-old Malcolm Little, 19-year-old James Reeves, and then 18-year-old Roger Dickerson. All of them also had objects shoved into their rectum or their other part. On January 3rd, 1975, a 17-year-old named John Laris had been kidnapped. He was found murdered the following day near Sunset Beach. He had objects shoved into his body, and he was strangled. A couple of weeks later, 21-year-old Craig Jonatis, his body was discovered. He was found along the Pacific Coast Highway in the parking lot of a hotel. He too had been strangled to death. So by January of 1975, they actually have a tally of about 14 men at that point who had been found murdered, typically strangled and castrated or defiled in some other way. And it was the police's belief that all of these victims were being killed by the exact same person. On March 29th, that's my birthday, 1975, a young man named Keith Crotwell and a friend of his named Kent May, they were lured away from Long Beach, California, and they were seen getting into the Mustang of a man. They were both given, high levels of Valium and also a lot of alcohol. I guess from what I understand, Kent May was able to get away, but Crotwell was not, and he was later found on May 8th, murdered. A very aware bystander, noticed potentially someone by the area where the body was eventually found, and so they felt whatever was happening was suspicious. They didn't see the body, but felt something was strange, and so they took down a license plate number. And so that license plate number was given to police, which led them to Randy Kraft. Police brought him in for questioning. Now, I don't know if the friend who managed to get away, I don't know if he actually visually identified Kraft or not, because he was in a catatonic state when this all initially happened, when he finally kind of came to and his friend was missing. But I don't know if he actually identified him or not. But Kraft was interrogated by police. Apparently, the autopsy of Crotwell determined, I don't know how, but that he died of an accidental drowning. And there was no physical evidence to actually connect Randy Kraft to that murder. And this is why I kind of assumed that the friend who managed to get away was not able to visually identify him or not, because the police wanted to file a murder charge against Randy Kraft. But the DA was like, we don't have anything to suggest this was him. And so they let him go. And this is actually despite, at that point, Randy Kraft had admitted he met two youths in this parking lot. He did, had fun with him or whatever, but then he says he dropped him back off at the parking lot. And that's his story. And they had no choice but to go. I mean, they didn't believe him, but they just had no choice. They had to let him go because they had no evidence. And then all was quiet for almost a year. And then on December 31st of that same year, 1975, a 22-year-old man named Mark Hall went missing. This was near San Juan Capistrano. He would later be found. He was essentially tied to a tree, and he had leaves and other things shoved all the way down his trachea. I mean, just completely filled up. And he died of asphyxiation slowly from all of that. And he also was sexually assaulted and he was sexually mutilated. The autopsy determined that, unfortunately, he was alive during all of it. And he died a very slow, very painful, and very uncomfortable death. It's believed that because he then got into a relationship with a man in 1976, that this created a long gap of nothingness when it came to the murders. That he was involved in a relationship and so he wasn't killing anyone. Now, the majority of the murders happened in California, but he was also known to have killed some people in Portland, Oregon, because he had traveled up there. And a couple of young men were killed in that area, and they were killed in a very similar fashion that all the victims he had killed in California, it's all basically identical to it. He then eventually found his way back to California. At 1:10 a.m. on May 14th, 1983, California Highway Patrol officers pulled over a car who was driving a little iffy, appeared to be a drunk driver, and this was on Interstate 5 near Orange County. The driver pulled over. He then immediately got out. He was like stumbling around. He took a beer bottle and he threw it on the ground. The officers approached him kind of cautiously, and then he eventually identified himself as Randy Kraft. His pants were unbuttoned as if, who knows? I don't know. The other officer approached the passenger seat. When they opened the door, they saw a young man in that seat slumped over like this, not moving whatsoever. And he had a jacket covering his body. The officer tried to alert him or wake him up, but it wasn't working. This is because that man was dead. When he removed the jacket, his pants were undone and he was nude, essentially. And his hands were bound with a shoelace. The man was later identified as 25-year-old Terry Lee Gambrell. He had been a Marine stationed at the El Toro Air Base. His cause of death was strangulation. Randy Kraft was arrested. The body was taken to the morgue. The car was confiscated, and they searched it for evidence. In the car, they found a lot of alcohol. They found tranquilizers, a whole bunch of prescription drugs, stimulants. The floor of the car was just drenched in blood. They also found an envelope with about 50 to 60 photos or so, and all of these photos were of nude younger men. And then they found a ring binder, and they found a piece of paper with a blood stain on it, and it had 61 coded notations. They then got a warrant to search Randy Kraft's home, and in the home they found more evidence. They found belongings that belonged to men who were either missing or had been found murdered. Police at the apartment found fibers from, his carpet that were identical in appearance to fibers that were found on some of the victims' bodies. They were able to forensically analyze these carpet fibers, and again, they're a visual match, but they didn't really have a way of saying that this was the exact carpet fibers, but it was close enough. They also found a photo of one victim who was deceased that was in this, envelope of photos. And this deceased victim was sitting on a couch, and then the couch seen in the photo was the exact couch and positioning and everything seen in Kraft's house. They also found a roll of film in his house that they developed, and they found photos of victims Eric Church and Roger Duvall, and these were photos of them sitting in Kraft's car. And in one of those photos, there is a very obvious ligature mark around one of the victims' necks. So these were photos of the victims in the car, dead. And then they go back to that piece of paper with a bunch of coded messages or coded sayings on it. But what they finally determined was that each coded phrase or word or whatever was matched to a murder victim or a double homicide case. Some of these things weren't really coded messages, they were like initials of some of the victims. And then some of them were like the form or the form, I guess, of murder or what happened to that victim. Though it didn't have like the victim's name, it just had what he did to them in some kind of coded way. And like whether or not he tortured them, strangled them, killed them, assaulted them. And some of them had like locations of where some of the bodies were found. So there's 61 names, or 61 entries, I should say. Some of the victims they found, they couldn't exactly link to this list, but it was also a coded list, and so it was really difficult to match. But there was enough on that list to determine that this was a list of victims. So on May 16th, 1983, Randy Kraft was charged with 16 counts of murder. These are 16 victims that they can link with absolute positive certainty that Randy Kraft was responsible for doing. This is after police interviewed over 700 people, investigated his house, his car, the last known whereabouts of a lot of these victims, and where he was during those times. They did a very detailed and extensive investigation into this guy. He was charged with the murders of 20-year-old Edward Moore, 17-year-old Kevin Bailey, 20-year-old Ronnie Weeb, 18-year-old Keith Crotwell, 22-year-old Mark Hall, 18-year-old Scott Hughes, 23-year-old Roland Young, 20-year-old Richard Keith, 23-year-old Keith Klingbeil, 21-year-old Michael Inderbeaton, 20-year-old Donald Crizel, 19-year-old Robert Loggins, 21-year-old Eric Church, 20-year-old Roger Duvall, 18-year-old Jeffrey Nelson, and 25-year-old Terry Lee Gambrell. He's also suspected in the murders of Wayne Duquette, Vincent Cruz Mestis, Malcolm Little, James Reeves, Roger Dickerson, John Laris, Craig Jonatas, Richard Crosby, Gregory Wallace Jolly, Jeffrey Sayer, Mark Allen Mars, Michael O'Fallon from Portland, Oregon, Michael Cluck, also from Portland, Oregon, Christopher Allen Williams, Raymond Davis, Robert Avila, Arne Mikhail Lane, Brian Witchler from Portland, Oregon, Anthony Jose Silvera, also from Portland, Oregon, Dennis Alt from Grand Rapids, Christopher Shoeborn, also from Grand Rapids, Lance Taggs, and several unidentified male victims. On September 26, 1988, Randy Kraft goes on trial for these murders. The prosecution brought forth over 150 people to testify. They had over 1,000 exhibits to show as evidence. This was one of the longest, most detailed trials in that part of California, like ever. They had a ton of blood stains found in the car, in the apartment. They had hair samples found in the apartment, the car, on the murder victims. There were fingerprints found on certain pieces of evidence near the bodies that matched Randy Kraft. Fingerprints found like in the home that matched the victims. They had the photos of certain victims deceased in areas known that Kraft owned, like his car and his house. They had a bunch of prescription drugs found in Kraft's home and car that matched drugs found in the system of many of these victims. That's more circumstantial because they can't obviously prove that that was the exact drugs used, like his drugs were used, but it was enough. They found a buck knife in his car that had some blood on it. They had receipts from Randy Kraft showing what parts of the country he was in, with timestamps to prove he was in places like Portland, Oregon, and Grand Rapids, and also various locations in California. They had so much unbelievable amounts of evidence against this guy to show that he committed these murders. The trial lasted over a year. To put it into perspective, I think the average length of a murder trial is sometimes around 3 to 4 weeks. Because of how extensive this trial was and how much evidence there was, the jury had a boatload of things they had to sift through. So this wasn't like they went into the room, came out 5 minutes later and said, yeah, he's guilty. It took them 11 days to deliberate because of how much evidence there was. They had to do that due diligence as a jury. With that much evidence, with that much testimony, it was going to take a long time regardless. On May 12, 1989, Randy Kraft was found guilty on all 16 counts of murder. He was also found guilty on a count of sodomy, and I think a couple of counts of emasculation. On August 11th, 1989, the jury recommended the penalty be a death sentence. The judge would agree. There was evidence with a lot of these murders to indicate that there may have been at least one other person involved, possibly helping Randy Kraft. One of his former lovers, a man named Jeff Graves, was suspected to be a potential accomplice. But he died of AIDS in 1987, so there was really not much more they could do about that. Just recently, in November of 2023, they identified another victim of Randy Kraft. 49 years ago, or 50 years ago almost at this point, there was a victim who was found who had been unidentified for that entire 49 years. But one of the bodies was finally identified as Michael Ray Schlicht, and he was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His body was found on September 14th, 1974, indicating he was one of the first victims of this guy. And he was 17 years old at the time of the murder. And so while he isn't being charged with that murder, it is believed that this was just yet another victim. They have tallied up to what they believe and think is at least 67 victims of Randy Kraft, known as the Scoreboard Killer. He was called the Scoreboard Killer, obviously because of that sheet of paper he had with the coded names and messages and stuff on it. 67 murders. To be honest with you, I had actually never heard of him before. Not until very recently, which is unbelievable because this dude is prolific. I mean, that's 16 murders on its own that he was convicted for is a shit ton, but 67 murders? That's insane. Not to mention, around this time, there were actually at least one or two other freeway killers going around. This guy, Randy Kraft, was at one point mislabeled the freeway killer, but the freeway killer was actually someone different. And so that's why he's been given that moniker of the Scoreboard Killer to differentiate him from the others. There was a guy named Patrick Kearney who killed at least 28 boys. And then there was also William Bonin. Now, William Bonin had a very similar fashion of disposing of bodies. And so there was some confusion at points of what victims belonged to who. Bonin tended to kill people usually between like 12 and 19, whereas the average age of Kraft's victims were more like in the 20s, the ages of 20s. So it was a convoluted mess that there were numerous serial killers going around, but they kind of were able to link these victims to the right people. But Randy Kraft is exactly where he should be, on death row. And unfortunately, to this very day in 2024, he's still there. He has not been executed yet. I know he has had some appeals out there, but they've obviously been denied. But he is rotting away in a prison cell awaiting his execution. And so the 16 victims he was officially charged and convicted of, plus the 67 total he likely killed, if not more, at least they all will finally get the justice they all very rightfully deserve. But that is it for this case. True crime, Rooney Dooney, Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, please subscribe, give this video a like so more people can see it. Follow me over on TikTok. Check out the merch store if you want to. Recommend a case to my email. Name of the case, where it happened, when it happened. I'll add it to the list. It'll be a while. Blah, 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 blah. You know the drill at this point, folks. Unless you're new, then you don't know the drill. And that's the drill. That was the drill. I don't use drills because I'm a gay man. Gay men don't use tools. It's true, it's a fact. We're allergic to them. A screwdriver? A what? What is that? Is it a drink? Yeah, sure, I'll take a screwdriver. I'll down one. I'll also take a Long Island iced tea. That's not a tool, but I will take them because they're delicious. Absolutely delicious. But back to what I was saying. Stop calling me a man. A man with tools. Tools. Tim the Tool Man. I don't know where I'm going with this. Do you? Do you know where I'm going with this? I don't know. This is... I'm a man. I identify as a male, right? But I'm a gay man. So tools... Actually, you know what? I literally used tools yesterday. I was putting some stuff together, and this has all been a lie. Gay men can use tools. It's true. Oh. Well, this was something. I was supposed to say goodbye, but I rambled? That's not even a word. I rambled on for God knows how long. Well, you'll probably know how long based on the timestamp of the video. You'll be able to calculate exactly how long I rambled on for. But right now, I don't know how long I've been rambling on for because it's been, I don't know. I don't know. Oh, God damn it. Hi. Well, anyway, if you're new here, I am so sorry that you don't know what this is about. But if you watch on my videos, you'll know. Okay. Smell you later, folks. That hurts so bad.